All right, folks, we are going to get started. Welcome to the College of Education and Human Ecology. Thank you so much for making some time in your busy schedules to talk about ungrading. I'm really excited. I've got a great group of folks to talk about ungrading and their sort of experience with ungrading, their origin stories. And so what we're going to do is introduce ourselves, and then there's some discussion that we'll have amongst each other on the panel. And then I did pull some questions from the registration form that we get to vote. Which question do we want to talk about? Very exciting. We may cover some of those questions in our back and forth up here. My name is Charles Logan, and I am the educational technologist here in the College of Education and Human Ecology. Let me just point out, we will, it's live. You can go over to the go.osu.edu/ungrading, and there are a bunch of resources there, both from Ohio State as well as from other folks who are doing ungrading. There are a lot of people who are experimenting with ungrading. And so I would recommend checking out some of those resources. If you're a Twitter person, we're going to use that hashtag ungradingosu. The other thing I'll just point out too, so this is being recorded with Zoom, but I have a Google slide here, and so you'll see Google Slides now allows you to do live closed captioning, which is super great. It, as you'll see, is not 100% accurate, but it's better than nothing. And then also when Zoom is recorded, those will also have closed captioning. So again, trying to think about accessibility here at Ohio State as a priority. So that's enough for me for now. I'm just going to ask everyone to introduce themselves and then share a few words about sort of how you came to ungrading, and then we'll open up to some panel-focused discussions before turning it over to the audience. Do you want me to pass the whole stand? I'll just. Right, but we're also recording it for folks who are watching. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tammy Augustine. I am a faculty member in the Department of Teaching and Learning, and I work with pre-service teachers, primarily our middle school and secondary social studies pre-service teachers. I came to ungrading really honestly because I've been a teacher for a long time, and grading is the bane of my existence in the education field. And so I thought, how can I do this? It was creating tension between me and my students. Grades are inflated. I couldn't give the kind of feedback I wanted, and subpar work was getting through. And I was like, and I was spending so much time, all this great feedback, and they were like, yeah, okay. Now, in my students' defense, they've been trained. They come to me with all of this baggage around grades. So I thought, well, how can we tackle this? So that's sort of how really it was just, I wanted to reduce the tension, create better quality work, and spend less of my life grading. So.
Hi, is this on? Yeah? No? Okay. Hi, I'm Gavin Johnson. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of English here at OSU, and I study rhetoric composition and digital media studies, specifically writing pedagogy. Ungrading. I've really come to ungrading from a long history of my own anxiety with grades. I'm about to exit student life permanently once I defend this dissertation, but throughout my entire life as a student, I've had ridiculous anxiety about grades. So when I shifted into a graduate student and an instructor of record for writing courses, I was always very weary about what the grades that I was putting on work was doing to students. So it's kind of been a slow progression from a few no credit assignments, just free writes, the kind of stuff that I think probably a lot of us do in our classrooms, to finally I wrote I wrote a piece that's coming out soon about the way that learning management systems track grading data and how grading data can be used to surveil students and teachers. And once I wrote that piece, I was like, okay, I can no longer do this. So I threw grades out of the course as much as possible. I wasn't using the term ungrading. I was using the really inaccurate term of gradeless, which isn't true because obviously at the end of the semester, a grade has to be assigned regardless of what happens. So I'm still thinking through the term ungrading, actually, but as of right now, I'm studying a lot in the literature of reduced grading, anti-racist pedagogies, and thinking about what our evaluation and what our feedback would look like if it was taken on face value of the feedback and not the symbol below the feedback.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Jim O'Donnell. I'm a PhD student in the art education department. I came to ungrading, so I like the term ungrading. I was also doing what Gavin was saying was a gradeless terminology, and that is sort of a little bit misleading, I think. It is interesting how just the way you name things and the way that you frame this practice, whatever it is, really does influence the way that people receive it and think about it. A lot of people hear ungrading or gradeless and they sort of cock an eyebrow and just sort of, look at you funny. I came to this by way of the art. So my background is as an art teacher and an artist. And I sort of, over time, became, and I had the opportunity to teach in public schools and teach at the university level, and I sort of became gradually increasingly uncomfortable with the way that grades were applied, at least in practice in art classes, where it seemed to conflict a lot of the times with the goal, which in my mind a lot of times was creativity. So I became that sort of was the nudge. Some of the best classes I taught were classes where I had the freedom, and maybe because of the arts, I had the freedom to experiment with sort of different strategies where I might not have had the freedom otherwise. So I've done everything from having systems where there was no cap on the amount of points that students could get in a class to things where there were no grades. And those were often the best classes I taught with the most engaged students in retrospect. So I just sort of started looking into literature to try and see, what was out there about this topic. Not surprisingly, since I'm working on a dissertation, but this actually isn't what I'm focusing on. And I sort of became aware of things like Ruth Butler's research, where she found that if you were evaluating creativity, that was an obstacle to creativity. So that seemed to be, directly interfering with what I was trying to do with students. I became aware of the research around formative feedback and how all that good feedback I was putting on papers when I was struggling and learning how to teach writing was just going out the window, basically, because they were seeing it at the end of the process. And that was very familiar from the art classes that I saw a lot of the cases. So one thing I want to read here just at the very beginning to kind of put this on the table was, so this is from a meta-analysis of grading research. It's titled A Century of Grading Research, Meaning and Value in the Most Common Educational Measure. The researchers involved are from several universities: Susan Brookhart, Thomas Guskey, Alex Bowers, James McMillan, Jeffrey Smith and Lisa Smith, Michael Stevens, and Megan Welsh. And so this sort of paragraph I found really sort of put things into perspective for me, because this is some of the best work I think is out there. And what they came to the conclusion was, although some variability exists across years and subjects, correlations have remained moderate but remarkably consistent in studies based on large nationally representative data sets. Across 100 years of research, teacher-assigned grades typically correlate about 0.5 with standardized measures of achievement. In other words, 25% of the variation in grades teachers assign is attributable to a trait measured by standardized tests. The remaining 75% is attributable to something else. They actually just don't know what the other 75% of grades is measuring. And my argument is that I think it might be measuring how to school, your ability to school. So I just kind of want to put that out there, something that has been sort of a burr in my side and something for us maybe to think about.
Hi. I'm I'm Mindi Rhoades. I'm also, like Tammy, in the College of Teaching and Learning. I was a high school English teacher, and then I got my degree in art education, but now I do kind of arts-based teaching and learning. And like some other people up here said, I spent a lot of time grading and coming up with rubrics until, I could grade a standardized essay in my sleep for high school students. But what I realized more and more is that that the grades are not my goal. And I think kind of maybe like Gavin was saying, the minute I learned that the grades were not my goal and I started thinking that learning was my goal is the minute I thought, okay, well, maybe I'm done with grades. And I'm done in a different way maybe than other people are. I don't really use the term ungrading or gradeless. I just tell my students at the beginning of the semester that they can all have an A. And then I spend the rest of the semester convincing them that's true and watching them do more work than they do when I didn't give when I gave out rubrics. So it's really allowed me, I think like Tammy said, it's allowed me to individualize the kinds of learning experiences my students have in class. And so instead of spending hours grading things, one thing I've done that only in the past couple of years that has revolutionized my teaching is taking that time and signing it up for student writing conferences and research conferences instead. Spending 20, 30 minutes with a student or a small group has been, I think, paradigm shifting for me as a teacher. And I'll continue to do that from here on out. But really my goals are for grades aren't my goals. Engagement and learning are my goals. And I found grades kind of antithetical to that process. So, and kind of like Jim, like, what does it even mean? Like, I have a hard time even conceptualizing now how grades attach to and high-stakes standardized testing may have been the thing that did me in, is that those numbers represent literally almost nothing except for socioeconomic status, and I don't want to grade on that either. So, all right.
For the panelists, are there any follow-up questions that you wanted to ask a fellow panelist before I ask the next question? The panel full of teachers will have a lot of wait time, and so if they're long pauses, it's intentional. So, Mindi, you sort of brought this up, and other folks too, and then we'll talk about some of the audience questions. But that sense of because it often is paradigm shifting, I'm curious about the students' response to ungrading or to moving away from even a single assignment that sort of bucks the trend of a system of doing school, which many of them are very good at. How they respond to all of a sudden when you present them, a whole different way of thinking about their own learning. And again, we don't have to go down the line. We can just, if someone wants to jump in.
Yes, I talked to my class this week about this. And not only am I going away from grades, in some ways I am moving away from assignments as a whole in a way. One of the things I do with one of my doctoral courses, the main assignment, is an impossible assignment. They're supposed to create either a proposal or a paper manuscript working alone or in groups. And you can't get it done in a semester. You can't write something publishable in a semester. I mean, these are the first-year doc students. They work their asses off. I've had probably in the past 3 to 5 years, maybe 8 to 10 student publications come out of this, and probably twice that many student presentations come out of this. And my thing again is that it's an impossible assignment. You can't get it done. If you want to meet after the semester and keep working on it, let's make some appointments and do it. And so I think in some ways, it's kind of like Tammy. It's like reestablishing a different kind of relationship with these students. And that it's been really powerful, I think. But I think it's also unnerving for some of them because they're so good at school. and I think for some, it's a really big cultural shift. And a lot of this I've kind of just negotiated or talked out with students. Part of it being, do you think it's okay for me to require the same amount of quantity of work from someone whose native language isn't necessarily English? Do you think I should grade people based on grammar at the college level? So those kinds of things. It's been kind of talking those out with students who've been very open, I think, in their feedback with me.
You said the impossible assignment, so it's something that they couldn't complete that semester?
Yeah.
That's how you frame it?
Yeah. I say this is the assignment. You won't be able to do it semester, but you'll have to present.
Very cool.
Yeah, yeah. I have been slowly moving away from very structured assignments as well. Especially, I taught a digital media composing class a year ago, and what is really interesting there and what I write about is what I call a coalitional pedagogy or praxis, where we're really working together to try to determine like what are their learning goals for the course and what that looks like. I think we all pretty much have a sense of the kinds of students that come to Ohio State. Very high achieving students that have been very, very good at school. So I guess it's really interesting because some students are on board right away, very, very happy, like perfect, no grades, wonderful, stress off your shoulders. And then there's students who think you're trying to trick them, which in my experience takes about 2 weeks for them to, or about the time when the first assignment feedback is starting to go back, for students to realize, oh wait, you're not tricking me. You're actually giving feedback on my project, not just a grade. I come from writing studies where feedback on student work is really standard. Like it's really part of it. It's never just a grade or just comments on grammar. It's always like deep structural comments on stuff. So I'm still doing that work that's considered good pedagogy in my field. I'm just doing it without the caveat grade on the end of it that often nullifies all of the good work in the front of it. So,
some of my students are absolutely relieved. They're like, oh, great. Some of my students, you can visibly see them freaking out. And they don't know how to respond. I work with both undergrads and MAD students. So my undergrads especially are very in the thick of this, my GPA, getting grades, and they're young. So it takes a tremendous amount of scaffolding. Now I have some luxuries because I work with pre-service teachers. So I asked them, I'm like, how many of you want your students to be grade motivated? And none of them raised their hand. I'm like, okay, how many of you are grade motivated? Most hands go up. I'm like, all right, well, if you want your students to do this, you have to figure out how to do it yourself. So we're all going to get really uncomfortable together and do this differently. And one of the things I do in a theme that I hear also is, although some of my students are so nervous, it's actually made us closer. So I've taken the time that I would have spent grading. I calculated it all out, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to meet with my students, because students don't tend to come to my office hours. I was like, I'm here for you, and no one would come. So I set up a work session. So for 2 hours on Friday, we go to a room, to a classroom, and I'm like, come, we'll work on your assignments. Every single one of my students comes. They started bringing donuts. They're like, can you bring the coffee? I bring coffee. They're eating. We're laughing. And they're sitting with their laptops. Some of them just with their headphones on, working. Others are meeting with me. And I'm still saving myself time, but what it's done is it helps them feel more comfortable and safe in this really uncomfortable setting. And it actually, it has been paradigm shifting for me, because it's like, how can we become the best teachers we can be together? So again, it also has created, like, they work harder than they ever did before. The quality of work is so much better, and the conversations have allowed me to give so much better feedback, but then also better quality instruction. Now, I will say it has put, the other way it's shifted for me is to say I have to get really, really clear on what I want and why I want it. So it has reduced the number of assignments in my class, because we're going to spend more time on them, so that my students who are like, I want to do this, we're going to get really clear. What are the expectations, et cetera. I have also seen, to echo what you were talking about for creativity, the students are now taking more risks, because they're like, I'm not creative. Are you going to grade me on my ability to draw? No, I'm not. So let's, all I want to see is your attempt to draw, your attempt to use funny memes or whatever it is for them. So they've become more creative. So, but it does take some hand holding at first, because they're, God, some of them really just afraid. They are truly afraid, but it ends up okay.
So to piggyback on what Tammy was saying, I also work with, all sorts of students. Most recently, I've sort of been applying the ungrading philosophy to pre-service students, specifically with the early childhood art integration courses. So when I am working with those students, I find some of the same themes that we've been talking about, where they're sort of very anxious, very paralyzed with fear. We get a couple of different things where we get folks who are sort of the perfectionists, and that sort of becomes has a stranglehold over their ability to sort of be creative or take risks, and then folks who are very anxious about what kind of grade they're going to get. And what I tell my students is it takes an amazing amount of structure to make it look like there's no structure. So I actually go the other way, to where I say, for me, it actually does require a lot more structure in a way than grading does. So working with the pre-service students, I noticed that for them to take risks, I needed to not, if maybe like kind of working out, if the first time I go to do something, if I'm working out and I'm getting sort of like nitpicked and hit with a stick every time I do something wrong or my form's off, that's, for me at least, kind of makes me less inclined to want to continue with that. So for a lot of these folks, the idea that they're going to be integrating art into their teaching, they'll often go to a sort of a Pinterest-y assignment or something very, teachers pay teachers, something very like kind of pre-packaged. And what I give them license to is I sort of model for them, and then they have to teach the next class. So there's a lot of feedback between them. We do online real-time feedback for each other. So they're teaching in front of a small group of other peers in a class. So I have 5 groups of teachers teaching each other and all trying different things that they wouldn't have tried otherwise. And then other folks are getting to see them try things. So rather than kind of making sure that everyone is performing one at a time for me, like I'm some kind of Roman emperor or something like that, like they're all just teaching for each other and utilizing their own expertise, with me sort of as a guide on the side, sort of able to come in and sort of support them. So at the end of the semester, we do conferences, and they talk to me about what kind of grade they earn, and it for most of the cases, the conversations are fairly easy, but I'm often surprised how some students will come in and give themselves lower final grades than I would have, and we talk about that, where it's like, well, I would have given you an A-, but you're saying a C+, so this isn't necessarily a negotiation, but like, where do you think we stand on that? Or students who really overshoot and say they think they did much better than I do, and that becomes a really important conversation, because they're going to go out there and do that with other people. They're going to be teachers, so just trying to model basically what they're going to do, the kinds of problems and challenges they're going to have. Why do you think you earned that, and can you support that? And that's basically what they're going to be doing with kids in the future.
Yeah, first of all, to that, I think, and to Tammy's point, as educators, I firmly believe if I want people to teach differently, that I need to teach differently myself. I don't believe people are just I can't PowerPoint teach anybody into being a transformational teacher. So if they don't see it done, I don't think they'll just do it themselves. I have a sneaky trick I use with with one way that I try to calm those students who are in a panic. A chunk of almost any class I teach is based on attendance and participation. And I make these little attendance and participation self rubrics online so they can just go on every class and give themselves, up to 20 points for how prepared they were. And honestly, I don't care if they fill them out or not, but it really makes those people who are panicked feel like they have some kind of control over part of their grade, that they can prepare for class and they can document that and kind of speak to that in a way. And I can see it. I can go back and look if it were a problem, but I don't.
I want to. I also want to point out that I don't know, maybe y'all feel different, but giving feedback, I mean, it still takes time to do the assessment, but feedback is much more enjoyable to give. And I give better feedback when I'm not trying to say like, well, I gave you a C, so for it to count as a C, I have to knock these things off, blah, 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 as opposed to giving really generative feedback on their writing and their research. It's just, for me as a teacher, it's not as soul draining as like the grading. It's that like quote unquote traditional grading. So I think that's really interesting too.
Thank you all. I guess one question I have is, there's all of this talk about paradigm shifting, and yet we're still operating within a system that requires a grade at the end of the semester. So it sounds like, Jim, you actually sit down with your students and have that conversation. My sense of ungrading is that there is a lot of self-reflection. I'm curious how you all negotiate or navigate the sense that we're trying to try something wholly different that is sort of antithetical to the system in which we are working, both as students, but also, and I will have time to get to some concerns about, I know we're all from the humanities up here, and I know there are folks who are coming from the STEM fields, and, we'll talk to the extent that we have insight into, being a physicist, and what kind of the accreditation might require a different approach to ungrading and grading. But I'm curious for now, how do you actually give that grade? Because you have to give a grade at the end. And so I'm curious how you go about doing that. And I guess to piggyback on that too, I'll insert two questions into one, which is poor panelist form, so I apologize. I'm going to hold off. Grades. How do you actually give a grade when we're talking about ungrading?
I do conferences. Some semesters I've done individual conferences, which I don't particularly like because it then feels very much like that weird power dynamic is back. So instead I like to use working or writing groups throughout the semester. So the last class we kind of just I meet with all of the writing groups, so there's the familiarity, and then there's also a chance to talk about, again, the work that went into this, into the course. So we're not throwing away 14 weeks of saying grades don't matter to then turn around and say, like, well, now tell me what grade you want. It's still focused on the work, which for me feels a whole lot better. And honestly, I've gone back and I've looked at like what my traditional, like when I was traditionally grading, my grade distributions looked like, and what they look like now that students are being more reflective and thinking through, and they're nearly identical without the stress and without the like everyone being very, very upset all the time about grades. So
So it looks different depending on it. In my mind, it looks different depending on each class. You know, whatever the goal is. For me, it helps clarify sort of what I'm going for, what I'm looking for, and what I'm hoping students are going to achieve or perform in the class. So with the having the conferences at the end, the way that would work would be I would have certain expectations as far as keeping them fairly simple. So did you integrate art? Is it appropriate for a public school setting? And maybe a couple of other things that I might be looking for. Often it'll be portfolio based, so the students will have to collect their work together and reflect. Yeah, it's reflection ad nauseum, but it's really powerful, and it's good because it gets that feedback loop going. In a lot of ways, you know, grades were sort of invented to communicate learning back to parents and at the home, but it's sort of become sort of the tail wagging the dog where the grades don't really communicate anything anymore as far as what learning happened or what they were actually able to do. So this sort of abstract notion of what learning is sort of has become sort of the dominant, has sort of dominated the discussion on learning, and the learning is already an abstract notion in and of itself. So what do we mean by when we're saying that they learn something? And just like I tell my students who, you know, I'm fortunate to work with teachers, I tell them, you know, I'm not psychic, I can't read your mind. I have to be able to see it, smell it, taste it, touch it. If I'm going to know that something happened, you have to be able to demonstrate it. So for me, it's performative. We video all of their teaching sessions. They are watching each other. They are giving each other sort of points along the way as far as rating each other maybe on a scale of how well they think they did versus the last time that they taught, or did they take their feedback, things like that. But we sort of, you know, it sort of takes all of that holistic evidence together and sort of, rather than me sort of being absconded into sort of a little private room somewhere and sort of, you know, sort of thinking, like Gavin was saying, sometimes it does become sort of, you know, that reverse engineering. It's like, well, I know this presentation got a C, so let me work on how to, you know, how do I get them there with this rubric or the point. So I see people, that tendency to sort of, you know, abuse grades is something that's there, kind of regardless of that tendency to want to sort of do that is sort of there regardless, and having the face-to-face conversation with the students, I think, eliminates that because it just humanizes the entire process again. And I think we have so many obligations and so little time to work with our students that in some ways the grades sort of become like this sort of replacement for all that humanity that we sort of lose when we're sort of grading people, like especially with artwork or something like that I'm working with, where, you know, if you could judge precisely which artwork in a museum is an A and which one is a B and which one is a C, you know, you have expertise that no one in the art world does, because, you know, that's something that an auctioneer, for example, would love to be able to have. Is like, oh, I know exactly what this, you know, how good of an artwork this is, but it's very subjective. So I just try and honor that subjectivity by keeping it dialogue based, if that makes sense. I hope that was answering your question.
I think I said about.
All right, we'll spend about another 5 minutes on panel-generated questions, and then think about some of the questions that folks in the audience might have. I know that one criticism or one concern with ungrading is, you know, students are going to be dishonest, or students might give themselves a grade that you know, they didn't, you know, in your eyes they didn't earn. And it sounds like some ways to counter that would be to actually meet with them. But the sense that if students are giving themselves, and it may just be an understanding of what ungrading actually looks like in practice, this criticism, but the sense of, oh, so students just give themselves a grade at the end of the semester. And it sounds like there are some processes already in place, but I'm curious if there are any other responses you would have to someone, you know, lobbying that criticism.
I mean, I think this is an important question. There are still expectations. There are still standards that students have to meet. Now, so many of our students are motivated. So we do talk about like, well, I want an A in this class. Okay, what does that look like? What are the things that you need to do and accomplish? And that's sort of how we set it up. I have had a couple of students who are like, well, what if I just want to get a B? Now, I will admit, I feel a little judgy when someone says that to me. I'm like, wow, I'm contradicting my own philosophy here. But so then we have that conversation. I'm like, all right, so what is that going to look like? And so they know right at the beginning what they have to do to meet those expectations. And so it's really actually, because of the additional structure, it's really difficult for them to cheat the system. And they can cheat any system, so that's an always, but So I think the additional structure and expectations that are much clearer has helped that.
I just trust students. Also, I mean, at the end of the semester, if they've gone through the entire scaffolded process, especially in a writing class, I'll do brainstorming, I'll do research work with them, they'll do peer reviews, they'll get my feedback, they'll rewrite, they'll do drafts. If by the end of the semester they are cheating something, I don't know what it is, because they still did all of the work leading up to it. So the last project, still has a few comma errors in it. I don't really care. So I've just always been I've done a lot of reading in like grade literature, as it seems like a few of us have, and there was always the complaint that grades were inflated and grades couldn't be trusted, and then when we try to take away grades, it's students are going to cheat us and they can't be trusted, and I'm just like, what? Like, there's no trust in learning? And also we're dealing with grown-ass people. Like, they are adults. Their boss isn't going to walk in and say like, oh, this was C+ work. Go on to the next project. It's going to be redo this project for me. So I mean, at the end of the day, really, I don't have an issue with it because I can't figure out what they would be cheating if they've done the work throughout the entire semester. Now, if they haven't done the work through the semester, then that's a whole different question. And that's a whole different issue of, well, maybe they should have dropped the class and maybe we should have worked with them at some different point. But that's a different question than they've done all the work, they've gotten to the end of the semester. God forbid they get a B+ instead of a B-.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, first of all, I'm trash. I got my hours mixed up. My name is Nicole Pizarro. I am an English PhD student, and I'm teaching digital media composition this semester. I don't know what the other people were saying. Clearly, I wasn't here. But through a lot of conversations that I had with Gavin, I realized that my worries were for my class that the students were going to come to this digital media composing class not necessarily at the same levels of knowledge with all the different programs that we were going to be using in class. Like maybe you have a Windows PC and you don't know iMovie, but then maybe the rest of the class does have a Mac and they know it. So I wanted to make it a class where the students felt comfortable exploring with all the different programs that we were using and composing texts. And so at the beginning of class, I approached them with this idea of ungrading, and we put together a contract, so they were going to do a lot of mini projects throughout the semester, and then the final project was going to be kind of like a portfolio where they would revise the projects that they did throughout the class, and then write a reflection on it and how they evolved throughout the course. And so we devised this little contract where they literally, they were the ones who made it. And they were like, if we miss this number of classes, or if these amount of assignments are late, etc., then we're going to get this grade. They were in total control of it. I broke them out in groups, and then we kind of like pieced together like the different pieces of a puzzle, and then we put together this contract as a class. And it has worked out really great thus far because they're feeling very comfortable doing crazy projects and really exploring with the different things that the media can do. And they feel comfortable knowing that sometimes it's going to work. Most of the times it's not going to work. And they're just exploring, and they're really comfortable doing that. So it has worked out thus far.
All right, we've got about 45 minutes left, and so for the next half hour, I just wanted to actually turn things back over to audience questions. So I've got a poll everywhere. It's a little bit difficult to see, but if you go to pollev.com/Charles Logan 030, these were the questions that were generated or that I pulled from the registration forms. So if there's a particular question that you would like discussed, you can vote it up or down, or you could also add a question that you would like us to discuss, and we can discuss it. So otherwise, we can just pick a question. But I thought, I'm an educational technologist. I'm going to use that master's degree, damn it. Yeah. I'm recording. I don't know. It's a good question. This is also the free version, so you only get 40 votes. So use your vote wisely, or ask your question wisely. And panelists, we can see this in real time. Ooh. And we can scroll, and I'll scroll, but you should be able to scroll too. Folks at home who are watching on the Zoom call, feel free to add things too. We'll spend about another 2 minutes. As I said, all this will be sent out to you all later. If you have other follow-up questions, please do send them to the panelists, not to me. You can send them to me too. I thought there was something at the top. Are you on the site? Okay. we'll have time to ask questions too. Yeah, if you would rather just keep your device away, we'll have a chance to at the last 15 minutes to ask questions too. All right, another 30 seconds. Clear winner up here so far. It may be that we have reached the 40 max. Again, poll everywhere is great, except it's one of those like freemium models. Okay. All right, 10 seconds. Get your vote in. And we're moving on. And as I said, we'll have time to take more questions that aren't up here anyway. Oh no! Now we got 3 tied for first. Somebody else. This is a problem. All right, I'm gonna, because I'm the head of this panel, so I get to assert myself here. You think it's democratic. It's not. It's all an illusion. All right. We have a clear leader now. All right, no more voting. Stop voting. Yeah, exactly. I'm going to purge you all from the votes, the voting register, like our Secretary of State. Anyway, let's start with this first question. I'm actually going to the second question because I think there were some strategies that we've talked about, but we haven't talked about that second question. And I have a feeling like, well, let's explore it. So how does this work? How does ungrading work in a larger class, more than 50 to 100 students? Yeah, please. So the question is, and again, and this is, I realize, again, that we're all coming from the humanities that have smaller classes. And in some ways, that ungrading, I think, is a kind of privilege to be able to do because the classes are small. And so when you have 100, even 50 students, and you do need to invest that time, like easier said than done. Like great for these, rabble-rousers up here to be able to do so, but if you're teaching a larger class, how do you manage that? Does Jimmy want to take a guess? And then also, I would say if folks in the audience have ideas or they have practice doing this, by all means, we can turn the mic over to you.
So, as a caveat, I haven't had to teach a class quite that large. Based on what I've heard of other folks doing, there's folks doing this in public school classrooms where they have many periods of students throughout the day. And I'm aware of entire school districts doing this. So, for example, in British Columbia, the Sea to Sky School District near Vancouver has gone entirely gradeless. So there's a couple of ways maybe that you could think of this at least. And one way is by maybe doing more pass-fail kind of grading as far as like, did they do it or did they not do it? So if you have a certain requirement or a certain task or a certain skill that you're looking for, simply just having it as pass-fail, like, keep trying until you do it, might be one way of doing it. My other suspicion is what kind of similar to what I did with the teachers, where I had a group of 20, 30 teachers that I wanted to all teach a lot, because you get better at teaching by teaching in front of people, and so dividing and conquering, so kind of turning it over to their autonomy and having smaller groups within that large group where they're sort of keeping track of each other. Did they did they present what they needed to present, or did they do the part of the assignment they needed to do, and sort of ask them to help keep each other accountable. It doesn't have to all be on you necessarily observing every single tiny detail or minutia in the course, for example. Those would be a couple of my of things that I would potentially think about, and I think Gavin would, Charles might, technology could probably do a big part in that situation too, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this sort of dovetails into that first question about strategies. I mean, part of it is just to start small. So where's that one assignment that you can do that maybe is a pass-fail, or maybe that is trying something different than you normally do. In terms of self-reflection, and this also I would say connects into some of the online stuff. Flipgrid is a pretty nice way to have students video or use video in reflection. And I would also point to folks back to that ungrading box folder, because there are resources from people, and I can point those out in a follow-up email, from folks who are doing this in the chemistry field, or doing it in math and science as well. I'm curious, does anybody in here teach a large class and does some ungrading who wants to tell us about what they do? Yeah, that's kind of like the big hard question. Does anybody have any ideas how they would do this in a large class? Do you want to talk about that, Minnie?
The largest class I have is 30, so just keep that in mind as I talk about this. You can do mastery-based learning as a way to begin a shift, I think, where it becomes very clear, like, here are the components. And that was actually the first step that I did. Was first I went to mastery, and it was very clear, like, you have to have these components to get an A, you know, these to get a B, choose your own adventure. And some kids were like, I'm only doing this, I'll take my B. I'm like, all right, cool. And I did it with just small assignments at first. And mastery-based, one of the things I also said was, you can resubmit it as many times as you want. So you don't hit it. You think you did this, but I think you didn't. I'm going to give you some feedback, resubmit. If you disagree, let's chat about it. So a lot of times what would happen is the students would say, I don't understand what, that was one thing I learned too. I thought my feedback was so clear. Students were like, I have no idea what you're saying here. So having the conversation, it was, I don't understand what this is. I'm like, all right, let's talk about it. And they would fix it right then and there, submit it, and I'd grade it. Or I don't grade, I mark it complete. Everything's complete or incomplete. And so I think the mastery-based learning could work. I like the idea of like peer groups. I think that could be really effective. Yeah, those are my ideas.
I haven't quite moved to ungrading yet. We definitely work in a competency. I'm in public health, and we work in a competency framework. So I can see how the mastery, like the competency kind of framework, could work in that. Although I don't teach a larger class, I used to teach a larger class. And even in my smaller classes, I've moved to group-based learning and group-based projects for most of the work in the class. And so that requires actually a lot of reflection anyway. And it requires reflection in terms of participation in the group, in terms of, you know, how much you contributed to the final product of the group. So I think there could be ways to take that kind of framework and really not necessarily, I mean, I have to attach a grade at the end of the quarter or the end of the semester, but saying to students, like, this is about competencies. Like in public health, I'm about you thinking outside the box to change the world, because clearly we've been thinking inside the box and we're in a load of hurt. So like, I need you to not be, you know, confined by our traditional systems of things. And so I think there's a real motivation in public health to like think outside systems and think outside boxes. And so even in large classes, I think it's possible, at least in my division. So I'm in health behavior and health promotion. I've been thinking about like biostats and like how this works in, you know, other places, but I think it's possible, even in large classes.
Oh, I was just going to add that I don't have experience doing this myself, but in regards to the peer group grading, that is something that's really commonly used in online classes like MOOCs, like large enrollment classes. So that might be a place for folks to look for resources, because that was my first thought and I wrote that down. But a quick question is, do you guys have TAs? Typically? Yeah. So I'm wondering how ungrading works with TA-ships. In STEM, we often rely, as Gavin's question was, how do you grade like that? We grade 175 students in a class by leaning on our TAs, which need that position for employment. So I'm kind of curious, as a former TA now creating a class, the closest thing I could think of is to ungrading in the STEM field that are with pre-vet and pre-med students is to allow them to rework things and resubmit, but that just sounds like more grading, like by regrading in some regards for my TAs. So I'm kind of wondering how that works.
So I don't know, is this on? Okay, cool. Just want to make sure. So I don't know, I don't have TAs, but I did TA like 80 students. I was in charge of 80 students for an intro to film class. And I think I don't know about med students, but I think it boils down a lot to what the goals of the class are. Like, it ended up being for that particular course, the main goals were that the students knew how to identify the different kinds of shots, identify different elements about filmmaking, and the process of filmmaking. And so even though there were a lot of test components in that class, there were also essay components where they were all given the same scene, and they would have to like break it down in an essay format, almost like, this is what happened then, and then there's a cut, and then this happens. And those things, my students were having a really hard time with that assignment, because it's one of those things where maybe the first time that you do this breaking down of a scene assignment, you don't necessarily know all the things that are happening, or you cannot automatically see them, I guess. And so what was the point of giving them a grade and grading them that first time if it's a thing that takes practice, like knowing how to discern the differences? It's something that you learn how to do. And so in thinking about it, I think back to that class a lot, because it was just a lot of grading. And I'm not necessarily sure what the students got out of it. And so I think that if you want to do these essays and that kind of stuff, you can have students learn how to break things down. You can have students learn how to use the terminology properly if you just give them time and teach them how to do it and allow them time to redo it. I don't know if maybe allowing them to redo the assignment once or twice would be a better way of doing it. I don't know, but it's something that I think about a lot.
Mastery-based learning and grade absolutely sounds like more work, but I will say, based on my experience, it was less work because the students were more proficient the first time around. So I spent less time on the majority of the students. I did spend more time with a few students, but because they were so few, and that's why for me, like, I had to get really, really clear about my expectations, what's the goal of this, what's the point of this assignment, and what am I really, really committed to. And I will say that they can resubmit, but there's a window, because then grading starts piling up. The first time I did it, I was like, resubmit whenever. And then the week before finals, I was like, oh my goodness. So I have windows now, because I want to believe my students are really motivated and are keeping tracks of things in their planners, but they're not. So that was one big mistake that I made. I will also say I've moved away from finals. And so they can resubmit, like, their final portfolio is just the culmination of all their assignments. And since everything's grade, I don't have to grade finals.
Got a question here and then in the back.
So I teach in STEM fields, and I just wonder how all these suggestions could apply to prerequisites. And you have to finish a prerequisite to get my class. My class also satisfies a major requirement for advanced math and statistics. How do you do all the standardization with, this many students? I think, like, in my biology is one of the biggest majors at Ohio State. How do you deal with thousands of students and satisfy this standardized knowledge?
I did it in first year writing, which is required of every student at Ohio State. So again, I think it's this question of changing your thinking about what the grade is actually doing. I think there's a point. I mean, there are certain things. If the student needs to learn every bone in the body, at the end of the day, that's learning a content set. A lot of what we're talking about up here works best for courses where you're trying to get students to think of problems or solve problems. So, at the end of the day, Bio 101 maybe cannot be ungraded in this kind of way. I still think that there's an issue with the rhetoric of grades itself, that we have to use A through F 100 to 0 scales here. I think we can do some more creative thinking on, well, how do students still learn content without having to use the stick and the carrot? That's what I have to say on that.
I think that's a really good question as far as what does this look like in other situations. So along the lines of what Gavin's thinking about is getting to what overall the sequence of what overall content, what overall sequence of events needs to happen for them to be prepared for that second level. So if I was thinking of a teaching sequence, what would they need to have gotten out of this course to be ready for that next course? Not having taught the biology course, I can't exactly speak to that part of the puzzle, but doing grading this way or ungrading this way has forced me to look at curriculum and reverse engineer, basically. So there's a concept we haven't talked about that many of you might be familiar with, which is backwards design. So you start with the end goal. What does someone who's competent in this subject matter in this course look like? What can they do? And then you take your very limited amount of time and you reverse engineer that. So what kind of things did they need to do? So for example, in the social justice writing course, which I'm teaching right now, I think back and I look at the way the course was handed to me, and I hope that no one involved with that course is in this room, but I look at the way the course has become structured because people just kind of check things off like, oh, they need to do this, they need to do this, they need to do this, and you get this huge mountain of things that they just need to do, but they don't add up to anything. You need to take, so for example, taking a step back and being like, oh, they need to write something about just this part of it, write something about this part of it, and take each little step and then put it all together for the end, and that's sort of the big paper at the end. I can imagine in a biology course, so for example, if I've seen poor examples where someone has been like, basically, if here's the textbook, if you can read the text and pass these tests, then you're done, and you do it at your own time, and you're done. And I think that's personally a kind of a poor example, because it's like it removes the need for us. Like, why are we there if you can just do it on your own? That's sort of more of a Khan Academy approach. But if you take that approach and think about it, you could say something similar where it's like, well, you need to be able to do this, you need to be able to say this, you need to be able to repeat this, and if you can do those three things, then you've mastered this course. Is sort of one way I'm thinking about it. So I guess it's not saying that there's no place for tests or quizzes or things of that nature, but I guess just kind of thinking about what those things are trying to achieve and how could you say it a different way? Could you get there a different way? But that might be, yeah, right. And you just kind of read my mind, which maybe gets to the top question up there. It's the taking the baby steps. So maybe it's just taking one part of a class or an assignment and saying like, okay, how could they do this in a more reflective or dialogical kind of way, or how could they do this in a more performative way? So, I think I'll stop there.
I do want to say again, but the standardized testing and things, like, I'm not opposed to the idea of testing in any circumstance. Yeah, I was kind of looking back at some Daniel Pink was saying. I was thinking about him, and I looked up some of the stuff he said about that these extrinsic motivators that grades and things are super effective if you use them for a really narrow band of activities, and one of those is kind of the memorize and process things that so the mechanistic things that you have to memorize, it's really effective to do standardized testing with those kinds of things. But I do think it's like, if once you get that, then what do you do with that information? I definitely think is kind of probably where we're centering our discussion more. But I think that, I don't want it to seem like ungrading is this, or not grading is this willy-nilly, nobody needs to know anything kind of approach.
Just to follow up on your point too, I mean, I do think it requires institutional change. You know, I went to the Teaching and Learning Transformation Summit yesterday, and so I think it's important that we do hold those who have power in the university accountable and say, listen, you know, this is a way of learning that we're interested in exploring, and we'd like to have an investment from you. And so, you know, obviously they invested in a day of professional development yesterday and brought in, you know, people and paid for them to come and speak to us. But I do think, yeah, it requires that sort of investment on behalf of the institution as well. And then support too. So it's not just be like, yeah, go ungrade, but then, you know, supporting it as well. There's a question from in the back here. We've got about 20 minutes or so.
Hi. Along the same lines of thinking about how this might work in different types of courses, I'm just curious to hear if any of you have tried this in a fully online course or a 7-week course, and how it might work in those situations, if you have any experience with that.
I can say that right now that I'm working at designing/redesigning a entry-level educational course, and that's one of the things that I'm really struggling with is how do I translate these kind of philosophical things into online stuff? And I don't know that I have a great answer for it. I know that some of the strategies I'm using are the kinds of strategies people mentioned earlier, kind of setting up almost community learning groups. So and student feedback for those kinds of things. I actually have been really surprised at the amount of feedback the students gave each other online. So I'm hoping there's a way to tap into that portion of it maybe better, to be able to take some of that grading pressure out. Because again, I was you know, you think like, they're going to do this, they're going to do really kind of a base level of whatever it takes, but they really were so much more engaged online than I expected. So I don't know if other people.
What's your name? Risa mentioned MOOCs earlier, and there's some really good literature out there on learning through MOOCs that I think can translate down into more standard online learning. But I also want to think about the tools that we have. Canvas, for example, which I would assume if you're building an online course at OSU, you'll be using Canvas, has all of the tools to make individualized groups where students work together in groups, discussion boards. It has mastery-based learning pieces built into it. You probably just ignore them or turn them off in your courses, but the tools are there. And I think it could be really, really interesting. I mean, I will say that it's something that I would want to think through a lot more. I don't know why it's different, but I feel like there is a difference. Like, my first reaction is you could just move it online, and it should technically work the same way, but I realize that I want to think through that a lot more.
There's a lot of what we're talking about is this engagement, and so I think that is the challenge. Just yelling out.
So take one more question.
Thanks everyone on the panel for all of your contributions here today. One of the issues that has been touched on by almost all of you at one point or another, but that we haven't actually sort of named here, is the question of labor, both instructor labor and student labor. I've heard from many of you that ungrading is either more work or less work. And so I'm not quite sure where that stands, but I've also heard several of you sort of celebrate that ungrading makes students work harder. And so I'm not quite sure where I stand with that it's almost like we're tricking them into doing more work, or especially when students do need to prioritize, if they're taking 5 classes, your class might not be the number one thing, and if we're taking away from them what they would say would be a kind of clarity or certainty about what expectations are, because that's not necessarily happening, but that they're devoting more labor out of uncertainty about where this is all going, especially if it's a kind of unusual circumstance for them, a kind of class that doesn't fit the mold of other situations they've been in.
Yeah, I don't think that's how it actually works in practice. Because it's not like students are taking on, I'm going to write 5 essays instead of the 4. It's not that kind of additional work. It's more of the change in quality of work and students thinking more intentionally about the work that they're doing. I don't see that as the same thing as tricking them into doing more labor. But no, I mean, you are right that there's this issue depending on your pedagogical style of, if you're not used to engaging students in critical feedback and doing that kind of work with them, for whatever reason. That's not a judgment call. That's just sometimes it doesn't happen. The workload shifts dramatically because this is asking for much more critical engagement on your part as well. But what I think happens is that students then reflect that back at you, so that it becomes this cooperative, this coalition movement. It's not I don't know, obviously we can't banish away power dynamics in the classroom, but there's this shift in the power dynamic that I think is really interesting and feels much more generative to me as a teacher than me going about and grading the same way that an automated system would. I think Jim said earlier, if technology could do it, or if you can just read the textbook and pass the course without the teacher, what's the teacher for? So I think that's part of where I'm standing here at this point, is how do we undo this kind of thinking that teachers are there to discipline students into doing school a certain way, and actually think about how students are learning, how we're learning with students. Okay, I'm babbling at this point.
One thing that I would like to add is I've had this happen a lot in my latest composition classes, where students will message me out of the blue because I gave them a B in an essay, and now that throws their whole Carmen grade off, and they're freaking out, and they want to know, what do I need to change in this essay to get to the A? And they're thinking about it in terms of quantity, when what I'm grading for is the quality of the essay. And if what we're trying to teach them is how to write within just academic conventions, how can they do that, or how are they paying attention to that when they're so focused on the number and what that number means, and what's the minimum amount of work that I have to do to get to that A? Because that's usually what they're asking. And so not forcing them, that sounds wrong. Encouraging them to don't think about it. These are the things that I want you to learn, and I'm going to teach you, and I will work with you as much as we need, and you can come to my office hours however many times you want, and I'll teach you how to work within these conventions, and produce something that's worth it and that will help you in your later work. better. I don't know. Like, it's really hard for me to justify what the difference between like a B- and a B is in an essay. Like, how do you do that? And it's unfair on them because, I don't know, half grades are weird and GPAs.
So I don't think it's necessarily that we're making them do more work. I think it's that their work is more meaningful. And so I think that they're more invested in their work. And if that means spending more time on it, then maybe. One of my goals as a teacher is for me to give assignments that make students think about it when they're not in my class. Like, I want them just like walking around thinking like, oh my gosh, yeah, how could I do that? You know, so I really wanted to be engaged with the concepts in that way. And so that's where I think the more work comes in for me, is that it's more engaged, it's more authentic, and it's more meaningful.
I'm really glad you brought up this issue. I think I don't think we want to give the impression that this is sort of a silver bullet by any means. That's a very valid concern, because I'm very concerned about that as well. Like, a lot of times, like, students, the work just gets piled on, and in education, a lot of times what we get fed is what I call an and sandwich. You know, it's always these extra obligations, more requirements, more mandates, and we're never thinking like, you know, well, what are we taking away so that we're going to have time to do this extra thing? So that is a valid concern. I do struggle with the time put in, regardless of what system I'm doing, and I do find that the quality of my time is better with this, but I haven't necessarily found it to have been saving me a great deal of time personally. But I guess, you know, for me, what I would, and there's also room for criticism here, you know, that I've heard from educators, where, you know, if you're trying to shift this paradigm, but there are students who need to learn the paradigm, you know, that there are cases where students might be better off in the long run learning how to play the game, rather than a teacher or somebody coming in and saying, oh, well, we're going to play the game a whole different way than you're used to, and than most people do. So there are questions about that, whether or not, you know, you're doing the most good for your particular community of students. So I think those are good things to keep in mind. For me, you mentioned a word, uncertainty, which is a big part of the crux, is sort of the crux of it for me, where I'm actually more interested in the uncertainty. I think about transferability, and for me, transfer is sort of the holy grail of education. And there's, in my research, there's very little evidence I found that what we do in the classroom is always directly transferable. And just me as a student, I've thought like that there's times where I've had a slightly different context, and I've totally forgotten like how to learn in some cases. Like, so for me, I kind of lean into the uncertainty, and I like that idea as far as, you know, I want the students to be a little less, not less, I want the students to kind of deal with that uncertainty in healthy and productive ways, if that makes sense. I think the world is uncertain. I think the future is uncertain. But I think that we can, you know, we don't have to panic about that, or we can learn sort of coping skills and ways to sort of manage that uncertainty. But, you know, I'm sort of in a creative field, so uncertainty is sort of, you know, the name of the game. Like, you're never going to discover the perfect art or make the perfect thing or know exactly what to do. But you sort of have to trust in the process. And I think that's what I think we're all emphasizing here, is that, you know, set up this process of trust where there's a feedback loop, where it's not just like a, you know, a machine where you put something in and a grade pops out and you don't know what happened in the middle, if that makes sense. So I would leave it at that.
Yep.
I'm also glad you brought this up. I will say that for me, time is, and I think for all of us, time is a very precious thing. So I am not kidding when I say I tracked my time. I had 2 classes that were the exact same thing, and I tracked my time. How much was the grading taking? How much was this ungrading concept taking? And I am without a doubt saving time. But the biggest thing for me is we're all happier. We're enjoying each other more. We're learning more. And so I think I was one who said my students are working harder. They're working more effectively. They're more invested. And so in some ways, I think to what Mindi said also, is they might be spending more time on it, but because they're choosing to. And then I think also, Oh, now I just forgot what I was going to say. I don't think ungrading is the answer for everything. I prepare pre-service teachers to go out into a very standardized world, and so there is that tension that we are always feeling. But I think it can work really well in some settings, even if it's just for particular assignments. But once they get over their initial shock, it's been really, it's been much more meaningful for all of us too. So.
I have 2 notes that I've just jotted down over this entire thing that I want to add before we finish. I think Mindi said it almost, one of her first comments was, you can't expect you can't PowerPoint teach transformational teachers. And that, that's part of my issue. I don't believe the argument that, we have to indoctrinate them into the game so they can win the game. I talked about the system. I talked about it a lot. It's not like I walked into class and just say, no grades will ever happen here. We spend time and we talk about it. Sometimes it's just during the syllabus day where, we just talk through that. And sometimes I taught a class on histories of higher education and histories and representations of higher education. So we spent a lot of time talking about grading systems, and it's really interesting when it clicks for students that, wait, I'm supposed to be actually learning transferable skills here. It's almost sad to realize that a lot of students are just like, I need to check this class off and then move on to the next thing, versus this realization, oh wait, developing a strong thesis for my essay can get me things in life? Wow. The other thing, I wrote this down really, really early, so it might come out left field. But as someone who's about to finish graduate school, I've been thinking a lot of the point of the dissertation is independent, self-motivated learning. And so my dissertation doesn't get a grade on the end of it. So if we work backwards, why can't independent, self-motivated learning be what we're teaching undergraduates to do as well?
Thank you, everybody. Thank you again to our panelists very much. So, round of applause. I will be sending out the link to the Zoom recording. The box has a bunch of resources in it. If you find other resources that you want to add or you have questions about, let me know. Thank you again for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.